Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm your host, a co-host, Glory, and today we have a special segment in which we will be talking about the issue that happened in Columbia, South Carolina, with Pentland and the young man DeAndre. We are lucky enough to have guest Derrick have a firsthand account of going to protests at Pentland's house. So here we have Derrick.
Glad to be here with you all. So I want to talk a little bit about what led up to the protest at Sergeant Pentland's home in Columbia, South Carolina. So there was a video that surfaced on social media where Sergeant Pentland and a guy by the name that we know by DeAndre were in an altercation. Sergeant Pentland is a first sergeant in the Army. United States Army. DeAndre is one of his neighbors who's a young black male who has some mental health challenges. And long story short is DeAndre is walking in his neighborhood like he does all the time. And that's according to neighbors who I spoke to directly who said that they've seen DeAndre in the neighborhood walking around, jogging around, exercising on a regular. It just so happened this day, Sergeant Pentland was outside, and for whatever reason, he approached DeAndre and basically told DeAndre that he was not welcome in the neighborhood. He asked DeAndre where he lived at. He asked him his address, and when DeAndre asked Sergeant Pentland for his address, Sergeant Pentland declined to answer the question and said it was none of his business, basically. And so you can hear DeAndre in the video saying, "Call the police," and speaking as a black male, I don't really call the police or anything. It's got to be like really, really serious. And so for you to hear a black man to say call the police, in my opinion, it was a serious incident because we've seen what happens when you call the police for help as a black person. You oftentimes are made to be the suspect. You oftentimes are arrested and sometimes even killed. And so when I saw the video, I immediately thought about Trayvon Martin, because the scenario was just the same. Trayvon Martin was in his own neighborhood. He was steps away from his home. He was approached by a self-appointed neighborhood vigilante who approached him and ultimately took his life. And you can hear in the video, DeAndre asking Sergeant Pentland, "Have you been drinking? I smell alcohol in your breath." And when you see the video, you can tell that Sergeant Pentland is, under the influence of something. And so altercation ensued. And so Sergeant Pentland ended up pushing DeAndre several times. He threatened him several times, and he stepped on his phone and broke his phone, which you don't see on the video, because once the video stops recording, Pentland then takes DeAndre's phone out of his hand and steps on it and breaks it.
First of all, thank you for coming today, Derrick. We really appreciate it. What was your initial reaction when you saw this video, and how did it correlate to you showing up at the sergeant's house to protest?
Yep, great question. So again, when I saw the video, I immediately thought about Trayvon Martin. And when Trayvon Martin was killed, I actually got in my car and drove to Florida from South Carolina, myself and two of my friends. And so if I could drive to Florida, I definitely could drive up the street to something that's happening in my neighborhood. But when I got to Sergeant Pentland's home, well, we had talked about it. A few folks and myself had talked about like going to his house the next day at 12 o'clock, showing up and kind of just confronting him. And so we didn't know like what to expect. We expected him to be home. We expected to have a conversation with him. We expected to kind of understand like what his logic was for telling a black man in 2021 that he doesn't belong in a particular neighborhood. And by the way, this neighborhood is predominantly African Americans, predominantly black. It's in fact, Pentland's neighbors, every single neighbor to his left, to his right, even the neighbors across the street and behind him, all of them are black. You don't see any white neighbors until you get like further up the street. And so I don't know like what Pentland was thinking, like when he approached this black man and said, "You don't belong in this neighborhood." But again, and I intentionally like went to all the neighbors' houses just to kind of see like, what are white folks at? And I really didn't see any, and except for the ones who came to the protest, who lived again up the street, and they were actually very welcoming. They gave us water, they gave us Gatorade, they even started directing traffic. But again, my initial reaction was, I've got to show up. I've got to go have this conversation with this guy because I need to know like why he did this and what his thinking was.
Bold of you. I did have a question. Were you ever fearful of your well-being when you pulled up to his house? Like, did you ever think that you could have been shot, something could have transpired, someone could have, started shooting? Like, were you ever anxious when you pulled up?
So initially, no, and probably for the first hour or two, there was really no concern. So when we first arrived at his house, it was probably maybe myself and maybe about 5 other people who were there. Myself and a couple of ladies, and I think it's just one other guy. And so as we got on social media and started like telling people to pull up and show up, we didn't know like how many people to expect. We thought maybe we'd get maybe 10 people to show up, 15 people. We didn't expect hundreds of people to show up, but it was great to see the people show up. But it wasn't until later in the evening, when the crowd got to about 200 people, somebody came to me and said, "I saw a red laser beam pointing on you." And so, knowing that Sergeant Pentland is military, I assume that he has military. I assume he has weapons. I'm sure he has weapons. And so, the red laser beam to me was an indication that somebody in the house was pointing a weapon out the window to kind of like scare us or whatever. Now, I personally didn't see the red beam, but several people saw it, so I'm inclined to believe them because they told me at several different times, different people. Again, I didn't see it, and I guess because I was so busy, like in the moment. But when I realized that people were seeing the red beam, I realized, wait a minute, he potentially could be in the house armed and could potentially like be ready to like shoot somebody. Because I mean, at this point, he's like all over the news. He probably has nothing to lose at this point, and so we call all the men over and we come up with a plan to kind of like protect the women and the kids who were in the crowd. So we set up a line of men to kind of like protect the women and the children from, like if they're in the event there was gunfire. And so, yeah, so that was probably like, but it was probably like about 6 hours before I started thinking about like safety.
Wow, that is amazing. So, I forgot how I even stumbled upon the video. I remember now, it was on Twitter, and the cover photo just looked very confrontational. And usually I try very hard not to watch things of that sort because I do believe in trauma porn. But that will definitely be another conversation for another time. But I did end up clicking it. I gave into my curiosity, and then I just watched things unfold very, very horrifically. And it was just to see how non-confrontational DeAndre was, and how the sergeant was so aggressive, very, very aggressive, belligerent. I was just very disgusted, and I was very, very terrified for DeAndre. I was just like, I don't know if this man is going to do some extreme bodily harm to DeAndre. And it was just like, you could see that he was really trying to avoid that situation from escalating into him potentially losing his life. I was really, really bothered when the sergeant shoved him in his chest when he was just looking in the direction of his wife. And he said, like, his remarks in his comment, he's like, "That's my wife you're talking to." And they pushed him. And I was just like, thank God DeAndre didn't have like anger issues or just didn't snap and tried to wail on this guy, because we already know what would have happened if he would have put his hands on the sergeant. Just overall, I watched it once. I did not watch it again. I just felt sickened. I felt disgusted. And I was just like, why does it seem like we're kind of moving backwards for every forward move that we try to make? It was just a very unpleasant sighting. I felt very uncomfortable seeing it. So yes, I guess like on the topic or the subject of trauma porn, which is basically just the hyper over presentation of violence or just confrontations, specifically really in Black culture, like always seeing us slaughtered in the streets, us innocently going on about our day and something just horrible or tragic happening to us. It's all over social media. It's plastered. There's no trigger warnings. And it's just like we sometimes are not cognizant of how that affects people to constantly be bombarded with violence towards our people. So it's termed trauma porn, and how it can be very harmful for viewers, or we just don't know how that can be internalized by other people seeing that, or just seeing it over and over and over and over. So do you all have any opinions on that?
Yeah, I've never heard the term trauma porn, but I think it's befitting, especially the word trauma, because the other day when I was at the protest or at Sergeant Pentland's house, I was saying on the bullhorn, I was telling people, like, since we've gotten to America, like, we've been traumatized, and how much more trauma do you want Black people to go through? How much more trauma can we go through? And people were saying, some people were saying, well, this is too much. I had this guy who I know who lives in the neighborhood. I didn't know he lived out there, but he saw me on live and he called me on my phone, and I picked it up because I respect him. So I interrupted my live, answered the phone, and he's like, yo, what the f are you doing? And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, you're in my neighborhood. And I was like, so what are you trying to say? And he was like, look, man, I live out here. You're gonna lower the value of my property, yada, yada, yada. And I hung the phone up on him because I'm like, bro, like, this is not the time or place. This guy literally walked from his house to the protest, came to pull me aside, asked me to put my phone down. So I gave my phone to someone else. And again, he proceeded to tell me, like, how this protest was not necessary. It was bringing down the value of his property. Meanwhile, this guy is like this. He's supposed to be like this pro-Black guy. He just ran for office and lost. And so anyways, and so I was really bothered by the fact that he had the audacity to come and tell me that our protest was bringing down the value of his property. And when I told him, I said, well, no, the value of your property started decreasing when your neighbor, Sergeant Pentland, harassed one of your other neighbors and told him he didn't belong in this neighborhood. And then I walked off, and I'm just like, bro. And so I deleted him on social media because I'm like, look, I don't need these kind of people in my life. And I'm like, yeah, so
that's crazy.
Yeah. And so that right there for me was trauma, because I'm like, I'm trying to bring more value to your property by putting this person out who doesn't belong here, and you telling me that and so yeah.
Right, that idea of entitlement and privilege, like, how dare you only speak about the value of your property when we have an issue that your neighbor instigated? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, the entitlement, the privilege is sickening.